Picture this. You're a biologist. The year is 2007. You've just stepped off a boat onto a tiny island in the middle of the Southern Ocean, somewhere between Australia and Antarctica, and you're expecting something close to a miracle. You've been told the cats are gone, every last one hunted and poisoned and trapped over years of exhausting, meticulous work. The seabirds that were being massacred by the tens of thousands every breeding season should be coming back. The island should be alive. Instead, you notice the silence. Not the kind of silence that calms you down. The kind that presses against your ribs. The kind that feels like something is missing from the air itself. Then you look up at the hillside, and it's stripped bare. Not like a clearing, like a scar. The tussock grass, some of it rooted here since long before any European ship ever passed through these waters, is simply gone. The soil is peeling away from the cliff tops in chunks, and across this gutted landscape, in numbers that your brain refuses to process correctly, rabbits. Tens of thousands of them, moving in a gray-brown wave across everything that still has anything left to offer. This is Macquarie Island. What happened here is one of the most unsettling stories conservation has ever produced. Because the people responsible for this weren't reckless. They weren't cutting corners or ignoring the science. They were trying, genuinely and carefully, to do the right thing. Macquarie Island is about 500 kilometers southeast of Tasmania. Volcanic rock, constant wind, overcast sky for most of the year. No permanent human residence. It's roughly the size of a small city, around 128 square kilometers. And for the majority of human history, it simply didn't exist as far as most people were concerned. A sealer named Frederick Hasselborough found it in 1810 and named it after the governor of New South Wales. Weeks later, the killing started. Not birds, not yet, but elephant seals and fur seals, slaughtered for oil and pelts on a staggering industrial scale. In just one decade, more than 100,000 fur seals were killed on this island alone. The sealers needed to eat while they worked, so they brought rabbits, calorie-dense, easy to maintain, and capable of reproducing faster than almost anything else you can name. And they brought cats to deal with the rats that always arrive wherever ships do. That's how the trap was loaded. 3 invasive species: rabbits, rats, cats, all introduced within a few years of each other, all sinking their roots into an ecosystem that had absolutely no experience with any of them. The birds of Macquarie Island had spent millions of years evolving in a place with no land predators. The petrels, the albatrosses, the parakeets, the rails, they nested directly on the ground. They dug burrows in open grass. There was no instinct programmed into them to run from something moving on 4 legs in the dark. When the cats showed up, it wasn't really predation. It was closer to a systematic harvest. One species barely made it out at all. The Macquarie Island parakeet, a small vivid green bird that existed absolutely nowhere else on the planet, was down to single digits by the late 1880s. Not a few hundred, not dozens. A handful of individuals scattered across an island crawling with cats. By the turn of the century, the species was finished, extinct, permanently, irreversibly gone. That's worth stopping on for a moment. The Macquarie Island parakeet will never exist again. Not in captivity, not behind glass in some future preserve, not anywhere. Because someone thought it would be practical to bring cats to an island. By the middle of the 20th century, Australia had declared Macquarie a nature reserve and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Millions of seabirds still use the island: royal penguins, king penguins, rockhopper penguins, multiple albatross species, and huge colonies of burrowing petrels. But the cats hadn't gone anywhere, and they were still killing everything they could reach. Research in the 70s and 80s put numbers to it. The feral cat population had leveled off at roughly 500 animals. Each one needed several kilograms of meat every week to survive. Run the arithmetic and you land somewhere around 60,000 seabirds killed per year. 60,000. Annually. Without stopping. The pressure became impossible to ignore. Something had to be done. So in the late 1990s, Australia launched a full eradication campaign. Poison stations, traps, hunting teams, detection dogs. It took years, cost a serious amount of money, and attracted real controversy from animal welfare organizations. But the scientific logic appeared airtight. Eliminate the cats, the birds recover. The last cat on Macquarie Island was killed in 2000. For a while, it seemed to have worked. Some seabird populations began trending upward. Notes were taken. People felt cautiously optimistic. But there was something the plan hadn't fully accounted for. Not because nobody had thought of it, because some researchers had raised exactly this concern, and the warnings got overruled by the scale of the emergency. When 60,000 birds are dying every year, urgency tends to drown out caution. Here's the thing about those cats. Yes, they were killing seabirds, but they were also killing rabbits. And rabbits, on a small island with nothing left to keep their numbers in check, don't just grow, they compound. Under ideal conditions, a single breeding pair can theoretically produce over 300 descendants within a year if you follow the reproductive chain all the way through. Macquarie Island is cold and wet, but it's grassy, and grass is exactly what rabbits run on. With the cats gone, the rabbit population didn't hold steady. It detonated. Within 5 years of that last cat being killed, the rabbit count had jumped from roughly 10,000 to over 100,000 animals. 100,000 rabbits on 128 square kilometers. That works out to nearly 800 rabbits per square kilometer. Rabbits eat grass. That's obvious. But the specific grass they went after, tussock grass, megaherbs, was the same vegetation that burrowing seabirds relied on for nesting cover. The same plants whose root systems were holding loose volcanic soil to the steep cliff sides and hillsides, where generations of birds had raised their chicks. What followed wasn't slow. It wasn't a gradual decline that scientists could track over decades and write measured papers about. It was fast, and it was catastrophic. Entire hillsides stripped bare within a few seasons. And when the plants went, the soil didn't stay. It went with them, sliding off cliffs, washing out during rain events that the island had handled without incident for centuries. Burrows collapsed. Nesting sites that had existed for longer than anyone could document simply ceased to exist. Birds that had survived the cats were now losing the physical ground beneath them. In 2007, 7 years after the last cat was killed, a team of Australian scientists published a formal assessment of the island's ecological state. Academic papers are written in careful, measured language. That's just what they are. But the thing those careful, measured words were describing was a collapse. The technical term for what happened is a trophic cascade. That's when you remove one piece of a food web and everything connected to it shifts, sometimes violently. Pull out one thread and you don't know which part of the whole fabric comes undone until it's already gone. The cats were gone. The rabbits owned the island. And the rabbits were doing more damage than the cats had ever done. Now you might be wondering, didn't anyone see this coming? Didn't anyone do the math before the last cat was shot? Some people absolutely did. There were ecologists, more than one, who raised this exact concern while the eradication program was still running. Their argument was simple and direct. You cannot take out the cats without simultaneously dealing with the rabbits. Yes, the cats are devastating for seabirds. That part is true. But they're also functioning as rabbit population control. And the moment you remove them without removing the rabbits too, you've handed the island to something potentially worse. Those warnings were heard. They were acknowledged. And they were set aside because 60,000 birds dying every year is a number that makes it hard to slow down. Because the crisis in front of you always feels more real than the crisis that comes after. Because conservation decisions get made under pressure, with incomplete data, and inaction feels riskier than action, even when action has unexamined consequences. It's a deeply human mistake. We make it in medicine, in economics, in engineering. We fix the problem in front of us, and in doing so, we build the next one. We are genuinely, almost structurally, bad at thinking 2 steps ahead when the first step feels obviously right. On Macquarie Island, the price wasn't paid in budget overruns or bad press. It was paid by the ecosystem itself. By 2008, the damage was being measured in square kilometers of bare hillside, in collapsed burrows, in the breeding success rates of species like the gray petrel and the white-headed petrel, still falling year after year even though the cats were long gone. In some areas, erosion had gone far enough that the island's actual physical shape had changed. Not just the plants damaged, but the land itself resculpted by water and gravity. And the rabbits kept multiplying. To their credit, Australian authorities didn't look away. In 2007, the same year the scientific reckoning went public, a new plan was put on the table. A total plan this time. Not just cats, everything. Cats, rabbits, rats, mice. Every single introduced mammal on the island, taken out at the same time. The operation was called the Macquarie Island Pest Eradication Project. The price tag was around 25 million Australian dollars. The method was aerial brotificum poisoning. Bait dropped across the whole island from helicopters, backed up by ground hunting and trapping. It ran from 2011 to 2014. One of the largest island eradication programs ever attempted in the Southern Hemisphere. And it worked. By 2014, by every measure the research teams had, Macquarie Island was free of introduced mammals for the first time since 1810. And then something remarkable happened. Which is to say, nothing happened, in the best possible way. The tussock grass came back without being eaten to the root. The megaherbs started growing again on slopes that had been exposed rock just a few years before. The soil held. Burrows got used again. Penguins moved through actual vegetation instead of mud. By 2019, surveys were tracking recovery across almost every ecological indicator. Burrowing petrel populations climbing. Vegetation returning to areas that hadn't been green in living memory. The landslide scars slowly closing over with new growth. The island was healing. Not fast, not completely. But the direction was unmistakable. And yet, here's the question I can't move past, the one that doesn't fit neatly into the recovery story. The Macquarie Island parakeet is still extinct. It was extinct before any of this started. Before the eradication program, before the rabbits exploded, before the cats ever arrived. The species that belonged to that island, that existed there before the sealers came in 1810 and changed everything, is simply gone. And nothing that has happened since, no matter how successful, brings it back. And those 15 years between getting rid of the cats and getting rid of the rabbits, that gap cost the island. Not in extinctions, as far as anyone can measure, but populations shrank. Individual animals died in burrow collapses they would have walked away from. Breeding pairs failed through seasons where the vegetation simply wasn't there to protect them. That accumulation, loss by loss, season by season, was real. It just doesn't resolve into a clean number on a spreadsheet. 15 years between the correct diagnosis and the correct treatment. 15 years where everybody understood what was happening. Rabbits cascading, vegetation collapsing, the whole chain of consequence playing out in plain sight, and the full-scale interventions still didn't arrive until 2011. Why? Money, politics. The bureaucratic weight of getting aerial brotificums approved over a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The sheer operational scale of what the eradication required. All of it legitimate. None of it particularly comforting. Because what Macquarie Island is actually demonstrating, underneath the headlines, underneath the cats and birds and rabbits, is how hard it is to act on a systemic understanding when our entire way of organizing responses is built around individual crises. We see the cat problem. We solve the cat problem. We produce the rabbit problem. We see the rabbit problem. we solve the rabbit problem. We are not wired to see the whole web. We're wired to see the thread that's breaking directly in front of our face. There are hundreds of islands on Earth with introduced predators actively destroying native species right now. Macquarie Island is a single entry in a global crisis that is still ongoing. And the thing Macquarie Island teaches, paid for in eroded hillsides and an extinct parakeet and 15 years that didn't need to be lost, is that you cannot touch one strand of a web without understanding what every other strand is doing. That sounds like something printed above a whiteboard in an ecology lecture. But there's a real distance between grasping a principle and executing it correctly when the funding is limited. The politics are messy. Competing priorities are pulling in 6 directions, and 60,000 dead seabirds a year are driving every conversation in the room. The people who eradicated the cats were not incompetent. They were not careless. They were doing the most they could do with what they had, responding to the immediate emergency the way people respond to immediate emergencies, and deferring the predicted secondary consequence for later. And when later arrived and the rabbits made themselves undeniable, they found the will and the resources to act. And the island came back. That's the honest shape of this story. No clear heroes. No clean cautionary tale. Something harder to hold than either of those. A case study in what happens when genuine good intentions run into genuine system complexity. When urgency beats comprehensiveness. When the intervention we reach for is just slightly the wrong size for the problem we're actually standing in front of. Macquarie Island is reportedly beautiful right now. People who've been there in the last few years talk about hillsides that were bare rock a decade ago, now covered in green. Penguins moving through tussock grass that comes up to your chest. Petrel numbers climbing back towards something that looks like normal. But somewhere in those restored hillsides, somewhere in the sediment, are the bones of an animal that didn't have a name in any human language until Europeans showed up and almost immediately erased it. A small green bird, thousands of years on that island. Now it exists in a handful of museum drawers and 2 smudged 19th century illustrations. The island is healing. The parakeet is not coming back. And maybe that's the thing worth taking from this. Not whether Macquarie Island is a success or a failure, because it's genuinely and simultaneously both. But the distinction between what is recoverable and what isn't. Between the harm that money, time, and collective determination can undo, and the harm that simply stays fixed. Because when a species disappears, no restoration project on Earth rewrites that line. The sentence is finished. You can repair the ecosystem. You cannot unextinct the bird. If this kind of story is where your head keeps going, the places where ecological systems and human decision-making crash into each other, where the gap between what we intended and what we caused turns out to be large enough to swallow an entire ecosystem, leave a comment with the island you want to hear about next. There are hundreds of them. Some of those stories are stranger than this one.